So folks, we're ready. Believe it or not,
They said it couldn't happen, John.
I am having to use this strange object here to find the passage we're going to talk about. And so, see, I was going to start class today by having a little quiz.
Uh-oh. That sounds terrible.
But unfortunately, since we handed you these sheets, you've got the answer.
Oh, sorry. My first salary is 16. Did anybody look at their sheet? It's just whatever is highlighted. Got them, and I don't know.
No, that, I didn't know that the sheets were gonna even be available, so,
Oh, okay.
but,
Alan just said
There are
bring these to
more.
class. She did not say pass them out. So I
right,
just jumped
no,
in.
that's
Anyone else need one?
actually, was not a very significant quiz. I was just gonna, since we're gonna be talking about food and dining. I hadn't realized what an immense thing this was. We could spend 3 or 4 weeks with this, because it's incredible how many things in the New Testament happen during a meal. And I mean, it's opened a whole new thing. In fact, I don't know, we may, depending on how many Sundays we have, we may do some more about this, because I wanted to talk about food and what people ate and what was on the table, but there's just talking about incidents that happened at the table would take far more than I think 3 or 4 Sundays to do. But what I was going to ask is my little quiz is ask you some of the things that take place at a meal in the New Testament. And even if you've looked at this, can you tell me something that happens at a meal?
People recline.
No, I don't mean how they're, I mean events. In
The Last Supper. that we already
The
said.
Last Supper, obviously. And if you think about the Gospel of John, a huge chunk of the Gospel of John takes place at the table. 7 or 8 chapters.
Matthew hosts a lunch or dinner for tax collectors.
Yeah, and in fact, that Jesus eating with people, I just had not realized, I did not put this together, how often Jesus is eating with people. And that's why I put on the little sheet which you have, Matthew 11, verses 18 and 19. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, he is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And so they can describe Jesus as coming, eating, and drinking. And I don't know why that has always just slipped by me, that you can sort of summarize Jesus' ministry from the point of view of his enemies, of course. But they're struck by the fact that he's eating and drinking. And part of this, and I want to get to the pictures actually first, but part of this indicates to you that eating and drinking is something that you had to do, but it also was a kind of a social event which carried some connotations with it. And they were not necessarily the connotations that would go along with a prophet or a rabbi, or a clergyman. And there I have on there, you can see that, remember the big dinner at the product when the prodigal son came back, and it says there that he heard the music and the dancing. And then you had the wedding at Cana, and again, we don't have time to go through this, but you talk about weddings in the New Testament period. And there's music, there's dancing, there's drinking. Almost always drinking. When we get to the Romans, for the Romans, a dinner involves essentially it had been totally unsuccessful. If anybody could still stand up at the end of it, I'm not kidding. This was just part of what happened, and there were the dancing girls and all the stuff you've seen in the movies. That's true. This is what happened, and the dinner would go on for hours in the evenings. That's just what you did in the evenings instead of watching TV. No Netflix, You dance, you sing, and you drink. And so when people would see Jesus at these events, it's not like he's quietly having lunch with some friends, at the delicatessen. This is not the situation that you have. So before we look at biblical passages, let's look at some pictures here. Let's start with the one that you have in front of you. Maybe I have to point, but you can see it. Let's talk about the Roman house first. Because of Pompeii and Herculaneum, where so many houses were almost totally preserved, we know how these houses were put together, and it becomes very, very valuable to us then in reading these biblical accounts. Let's look at this Roman house for a minute. Notice at the front of it, the bottom of your picture, it says shop on either side of the entranceway. Because this is the way it was done. And of course, a lot of apartments, even in LA, are that way today, aren't they? On the first, along the sidewalk, the first floor, there are shops. And if you live in one of those apartments, you know where the entrance is, and then you go up, and there's often nice luxury apartments. But on the first floor, shops. Well, this was almost true of all Roman houses in cities, not the villas out in the country, but in the cities. In the villa, you would still have the entranceway, the vestibulum. All these words, by the way, we still maintain almost all of them. So you come through there, and when you find these stories about, the girl Peter is trying to get in the house in the story in Acts, and the young girl comes to the door, and so imagine this kind of a building is what we're talking about. And so, because the entrance to the street is blocked and and locked, the one that goes into the home. So they're probably either renting these spaces at the front that have shops in them, or maybe the family owns those shops. The first thing you go into, it has no roof. Basically, a Roman house was just rooms around a courtyard. The courtyard was the thing. And so you had pools, you had fountains, you had plants, growing trees and flowering plants and so on. So you come into to the atrium. And this is where you would greet guests, and often guests never go past that room. That's where you entertain. It's kind of fulfills the function that we would today say our living room. When you have guests, they normally don't go beyond the living room if you have a party or something, unless you're dining. Okay. Some things don't change much, as you'll see as we go through this. So this calls it the formal reception hall. Here you greet guests. Then the next room is a little more private, but that's where the people in the house, and it might have a roof over it, might not, but it usually would. If you own some scrolls, they'd probably be in there. That's where your library would be. If you were an author or a business person, you probably had the equivalent of a desk, and this is where you might read. This is where you might have serious discussions that were a little bit beyond the social one and that kind of thing. You notice there's a little hallway next to that. You probably wouldn't go through that hallway because you're getting into the more private part of the house there. But then the next step you take is you go where you would have parties or feasts, or that, not necessarily the eating part, but maybe, I'll come back to that in a minute. And that is outdoors. If you've ever been to Pompeii, there are intact, it calls it the peristyle. Some of the peristyles in Pompeii are intact, with the fountains still there. They had statues around. Well, if you go down to the Getty, you'll see there's a peristyle at the Getty. In fact, many of these things, there is an atrium, and then you go through the atrium into the peristyle, and it's almost like being outdoors. At the Getty, of course, it has that long fountain and water there and so on. And then some of the private rooms that the people who live in the house are in have doors that come out into the atrium. this is it's a lovely design for a house. Everybody's bedroom is separate and the entrance to the bedroom is not, it's completely private. There's no way to get into a bedroom from another bedroom normally. It's just sort of your little place in the house. And then you go through the door out into the peristyle, and then you can go anywhere else that you want to in the house from there. Now, you will notice that they call this well, we still say somebody has a cubicle. This is the word for the bedrooms. This is where the bedrooms were. And at places like Pompeii, they have actually, in a few cases, found where the beds actually survived. At Herculaneum, they have one where the bed is still in there. I could talk about that. It's very interesting how that happened, that the bed survived. But you can see then along that line, you have the cubicle, and then it shows other sleeping rooms there, all with their outside entrance, or almost all of them anyway, I think all of them, into the peristyle. Then you see at the back of the peristyle, you have the culina, from which we get all kinds of words like culinary and so on. That's the kitchen. A house had to be a fairly substantial, expensive house to have a separate kitchen. A lot of times they would, there would be shops out in the street and they would get the food from there, or the bakery. I once went to a big a Drew's feast up on Mount Hermon, and all the bread for the feast, the women who were fixing the bread, serving the food to us, would run across the street to a little place where they had an oven, an open oven. And there were people baking bread for the whole village, and people would come and get their bread there and then take it back into their houses. Then you have storerooms, but now I do this in the way to come last to the triclinum, because the triclinum is, that's the dining room. And the stories that you read in the New Testament, where Jesus is at a dinner at someone's house, this is the room that they're talking about. And the reason it's called a triclinum is because the table has three parts to it. So the next picture down below that is a triclinum that was actually found in Herculaneum.
Wait, you're talking about the next image, John? Or the
Yeah, let's look at that next image. This one was almost totally intact. And you can see of course, you have little statues and so on around there, because you have your guests in this room, so you really you spend a lot of money if you have it, to have paintings on the walls and beautiful frescoes and statues and so on. In some of these houses in Herculaneum and Pompeii, the statues were still there when they discovered the rooms. But what I want to point out to you, you say, well, where's the table if this is the dining room? Well, the tables, of course, did not survive, but you see how the room is designed so that you can have three tables, or one table that is shaped like a U. And the master of the house, the chief place would be right where that arched thing is at the back of the room. There would be a table across there. Well, I think better, let's look for a minute at the next picture, and then I may want to come back to that one. Look at the next picture, because here you see the people at the tables. See, triclinum. There are three of them, and then you're served at the in between. There, you see the servants working there. Next time we're going to talk about slavery, and there were always slaves. Huge percentage of the Roman Empire was made up of people in servitude. And anybody who had a house probably had, the Bible calls them servants, but in Greek, the word slave and servant, same word. So anyway, you can see them serving. Let's go back to that other picture now so that you can get some sense of how that would have looked. You see, the tables would have been put on top of this sort of foundation U-shaped thing. And then the servants would come into that little middle area. And that way they were sort of at table, they didn't have to put things down on the table. They just sort of put them over like that. Or if you wanted to have your wine glass refilled, they could just stand there and do it there, almost like you were at a bar. It's a very interesting arrangement. And then you notice that everyone is lying down. I'm sure this took a lot, just like you have to learn, if you didn't grow up in China or Japan, you have to learn how to use chopsticks. I'm sure if we all went back into the biblical world, we'd really have to learn how to eat a meal, because you have to learn how to eat lying down. You have to lean on one elbow and eat with one hand. And almost everything, we can't take time to talk about the food, but almost everything is done by dipping. You have all kinds of dishes full of different kinds of dips, and you have the bread and you dip. And again, in the Bible, when you read about the Last Supper, you'll read about dipping. He who dips in the dish with me, Jesus said. Well, they're lying at and I notice the newer translations now will not say they were sitting at the table. It will say they were lying at the table, which is the correct way to translate it. So I hope these pictures are giving you keep these kinds of pictures in your mind when you read the stories in the Bible about eating or dinners or feasts or that kind of thing. Now, a feast is more than just the eating part. And so it would spill out into this peristyle where there would be dancing and where there would be musicians and so on. I would love to talk to you about the passages in 1 Corinthians where Paul is correcting the way they do the Lord's Supper. Because we know that the Lord's Supper in the New Testament period was part of a regular meal. It was a moment within the regular meal where the wine and the bread on the table were given the symbolic meaning of the body and blood of Christ. So even the Lord's Supper, you have to picture the Lord's Supper being taken by the early Christians in this kind of context. And I find it very interesting that Paul says one of the reasons you people are not doing it right is some of you are full and even drunk, and some of you are still hungry. You see, what's happening is when you have the church in your home, you can't get everybody around the triclinium. And so what's happening is that the people who are friends of the homeowner and can get in the triclinium, they go ahead they just go ahead and take the Lord's Supper. Well, there's still people coming in and in other places in the house, and they haven't been served yet. And Paul is essentially saying you ought to do it all together, because what you're doing is perpetrating this idea that some of you are more important. It's a very class conscious society, and the people in the triclinium are higher class than the people in the peristyle, or the people who are still out in the atrium, or heaven forbid, some are still out in the street trying to get in, you see. So that's what we're dealing with when that's one of several objections that Paul has to the way they're doing it. Now, the last picture I want to show you, and then we'll look at a passage, or I keep looking up there like that's a real clock. It tells me it's like 7:37 or something. We still got what? We still got 15 or 20 minutes. So, okay.
We got hours, John, hours.
We've got hours. Okay. Well, now let's look at the last of the pictures that I have. Although I want to go back to look at the passages, Sam, I'd like for us to go back maybe to the, just take your pick, any one of the pictures before, so we kind of have the picture while we're talking about the passage. But let's look at this slide. Now, this is a Jewish village. What I was showing you are the Romans. But of course, by the time that you get to, for example, the letters of Paul, all of his letters are written in a Roman context in which the houses that he's talking about would be the Roman style. In Jesus' time, during his ministry, even though the homes, say, in the town of Tiberias or Hippus, that are both quite close to Capernaum where Jesus lives, they would look pretty much like what I showed you. when Jesus goes to the wedding feast in Cana, for example, or when he goes to the various villages to teach, it might look more like this. This is just a artist reproduction, but you can see, this is just one house. This would be a fairly large house. But I suspect, Peter's house or Peter's mother-in-law's house or the houses that Jesus is in and the house that Jesus lived in. It actually says in one of the Gospels, when he went home, that is, when he went to his house, we always picture Jesus as sort of having an extra bedroom in Peter's house or something. It's hard to tell from the Gospels, but it's possible that Jesus had a house. If he did, it might not have been quite this elaborate, but it could have been. Do you see that this house up at the top of the picture has a triclinum? You see it? It opens out, everything opens out into the courtyard. What you really had in a Jewish house, a sort of substantial Jewish house. Some people probably just lived in huts. But if you had a house, you can see the bedrooms again are very private over on the upper right-hand corner. You have the triclinum. You have rooms where the women, these houses were often self-sufficient. The women made cloth. And then made the clothing from it. It's a little bit like the old American pioneer families, where you had your little acreage and you had, in fact, that American pioneer families lived very, very much like people lived in the first century in villages. Same kind of thing, preparing the food, growing, having the livestock. You see, the livestock is in the house. It's in the house. And probably the little boys, part of their job was every morning to get up, go get the cows and the sheep or whatever, take them out into the open land so they could graze during the day, the little shepherd boys. You notice people are on the roof because the roof was part of the house. It was part of where you stayed. Yes.
I had a question about that because the one time that I've been to Israel, one of the distinctive features that you see when you drive around is that every house at the top has like rebar or supports going out of it. And you hear that when a family expands, they just build up. They just keep building up another level for additional family members or for extended family members to move into the house with them, and they just keep going another level.
Yeah,
that's true during this time, or is that
that actually is the reason that they give. But I want to tell you what the real reason for that. You would not have found that. You would not have found that in ancient times. Okay. The law in Israel says that you don't start paying certain real estate taxes until the house is completed.
Got it.
And so they do that and say, we're going to be building that as soon as we have 4 more children. And that was the first thing I asked the first time we were driving. I said, what's the deal? And an Israeli said, well, I'll tell you what we say, and I'll tell you why we really do.
I understood.
The story.
I know.
Yeah. I think in biblical times, second floors would have been very unusual for a residence.
Yeah. Because
the top floor is it's what they use more for their peristyle, you might say.
Yeah.
And again, I've been in opera, like this same dinner I went to up on Mount Hermon. After we finished the meal, which was not at a triclinum, by the way, but we sat on the floor in that same shape. We sat on the floor. Then we went up on the roof, and that's where you have watermelon and tobacco of all forms. You had to take something. I took the hookah, because that looked like it would do the least damage.
Let me highlight this section of the video.
Yeah.
Well, it was that or a cigar, and I wasn't about to do that. So, but anyway, you can see the various things connected with home life, and you see the bedrooms there and so on. But this is more for people who are living in the sort of country style. But I'm sure that Jesus would often have been found in the villages, eating in what here is the triclinum for a Jewish house. Okay, so just I don't know if you just want to change them once in a while, we can, the passage that first strikes me is the one in Luke chapter 7, which I'd like for us to go to. I don't know if we get around to all of these, but in verse 36 of Luke chapter 7. Now, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. You got it? This is one of the reasons why I hope this class will be helpful, because it's just amazing the aspects of the story you see when you get this picture in your mind of what's going on. So then it says, when a woman who lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet, weeping. You get the picture? Some scholars have said that probably means that Jesus was at the end of one of the rows. If you see the triclinum, she might not have been able to get to his feet, except if he was the last one on the row. And she began to wet his feet with her tears, so she gets access to him and poured perfume. When the Pharisee who invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who was touching him. By the way, you know, we know now how far the woman had to go in order to get to the triclinum. I'm not sure how she pulled that off. She may have just rushed in before anybody caught her, but she's way inside the house by the time this event happens. And then Jesus tells this wonderful story about forgiveness of debt. And then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? Again, take any of these pictures I've shown you, and you can see the position that everybody's in. Simon, of course, is up at the head of the table, right? He's the host. By the way, remember what Jesus says to do when you go to somebody's house for dinner? He says, don't just rush up there to the front. You have to, you sit at the foot of the table, and then if they tell you to come up to the front, you'll be honored. Whereas if you sit at the front and they tell you to move, you'll be dishonored. So you can see they had a kind of a way of, you seated people at the table. We still have the idea of the VIP table or the speaker's table or something like that. We have special tables at our banquets as well. Well, anyway, that's probably enough about that, but it just says in verse 49, the other guests between them began to say among themselves, these are the other people who are reclining at the table all around. Okay, so that's a good example. Now I want us to look for a minute at the Last Supper at the seating arrangement. Sorry, Michelangelo, or I know this is one of our very favorite pictures, but it's not right. It almost is. If he had just turned that long table, turned the two ends of it around like this, it would have been okay. The seating probably is still okay, because he knew from the biblical account the order in which people were sitting at the table. Let's just look at that a minute. Matthew 26. Matthew 26 and verse 17. Been a long time since I had actually turned my Bible here. Do this. Okay. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this is verse 17, Matthew 26. The disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations? And he said, go into the city to a certain man and tell him, I want to have Passover at your house. So this is an urban house. And I know we have the expression, the upper room. So this may in fact have been a two-story house. But I think you probably have to think of the room itself looking pretty much like the triclinum rooms that we've been looking at here. And so the evening came and Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. Now, since they're essentially borrowing this room, you don't have the owner sitting in the place of honor. In fact, you don't even have the family in the house. They're not even there. He is giving this room, this triclinum, to Jesus and his disciples as a favor, apparently. Maybe they're renting it. I get the impression probably that Jesus knew this man, and he's allowing them to have this here. And while they were eating, he said, somebody's going to betray me. And Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. So where's Judas sitting? Well, if Jesus is sitting he is the host. So he's presumably sitting at the head of the table. The painting is right on that one. But he's sitting close enough to Judas that they can dip in the same dish. I've always wondered, by the way, who was serving? You know, there's nothing, but when you say who was at the Last Supper, well, Jesus and the 12 apostles, yes, but there must have been somebody else who was serving. They may not have been in the room when these events take place, but just something to think about. So he has a discussion with Judas, and then it says in verse 26, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples. So you see, he's got the loaf of bread, which somebody had served him, apparently. At least it was on the table when they got in the room. And he's breaking off pieces of the bread and passing them around at the triclinum table. Take and eat this. And he took the cup, he gave thanks and offered it to them, same way. There was one cup, as far as I know, in the New Testament, and in the old churches, liturgical churches, even though people they don't actually use one cup. You know, people take the communion individually, but there is just one cup that's considered to be the communion cup. And for centuries in the Roman Catholic tradition, people were not allowed to take the cup at all because they were afraid they would spill it. They did come up and take the bread one bit at a time. The priest acting in the place of Jesus, breaking off the bread and then handing it to them. But the cup they were not allowed to take. That was one of the big things during the Reformation, that the laity were allowed once again to take the cup. But it did create a problem because they'd always just had this idea of the one cup, which went back to Jesus at the triclinum. And then okay, I want to go to John now for a moment. I mentioned that much of John takes place, many chapters in John take place at this table, but go to John chapter 13 and verse 22. His disciples they're at the table, Jesus stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. By the way, you know, at a triclinum, you don't have to look around like that to stare at one another, right? Look at the table arrangement. You can pretty well see everybody where you're seated without having to turn your head very much, except maybe the person right next to you. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And that's why, and again, the famous painting is right. If you look at that painting, this is John, of course, and you would have to be, in this arrangement, you would have to be sitting next to Jesus in order to lean over. It says he actually touches him. He leans over and touches him. So that is further explained by knowing the way the thing was put together. Well, I won't go on with all of that, but Jesus, the part about dipping the dish and so on is still there too. But we'll let that be, just so you can see how this ancient form is the, I'm trying to think of the word in a play, you know, the, what do you call the,
Walking.
well, the scenery in the play, yeah. The set, yeah, the set, I guess you'd say, that changes through, the set of all of these, we've got the set now in our minds for all of these feasts and those kinds of things that you read, throughout the New Testament, all the many, many parts of them. Okay, I want to talk about one other thing before we, stop this morning, and I'd like for you to turn to Revelation 19. I find this to be very interesting also. Revelation 19. I already said something to you while you're looking there, about Paul and the Lord's Supper in Corinth. We could talk more about that, but it was a real revelation to me when I first realized that almost all of the problems that Paul sees with the way the communion was being taken there grew from the fact that it was being taken in a house and that it was a meal, and the issues that you have in a meal in a house when you can't get everybody around your triclinum. So they knew how to do a feast by spilling out into the other rooms in the house. But how to have the sense that we're all around one table when you can't get everybody around the table. And I will just say this, a few years ago, in a prison of all places in the Valley of Megiddo in Israel, they found what they think may be the first Christian meeting place that was actually designed to be a Christian meeting place. And of all things, it was a room in a military barracks. It was a military barracks, and at the end of the barracks was a room that when they began to clear it out, they realized that it was a room with seats all around there. They were seats, but they were plaster, you know, kind of like in a stadium or something that people could sit in all around. And in the middle of the room, there were holes on the floor that showed that there had been a table sitting in the middle of the room. And then below it, there was a mosaic that was still intact. And it was the names of two women. That's very interesting too, of two women. And it said these women donated this to the congregation. I don't exactly know how the words went. They think this building may even be 2nd century. I mean, it's really way back. It's strange that you don't hear much about this discovery. It was incredible. My friend Vasilius wrote the scholarly article about it. But what they realized was what they're doing is they've changed the triclinum, but only a little bit. They still think of the meeting place as actually being a dining room. Okay. They don't think of it as being an auditorium. That's us. They don't even think of it as being a sanctuary. That's us. The things that we call our buildings betray what we think the church is and what goes on in worship. I won't get on my soapbox here, but I could, believe you me. The early Christians did not think of the place they met like that. They thought of it as a dining room. A place where you and your family and your dear guests came, and pretty much nobody else, by the way. It was a kind of a private thing. But you could see in that place that they excavated how they were doing it. They had put the table out in the middle, but they still had the idea that they were all sitting around the table, but they put it on 4 sides and then did the communion that way. And that was basically what the place was for. My guess is if somebody was going to give a message, they just had to find a place to stand, and or maybe they walked around. I don't know. There's nothing looking like a pulpit. There was certainly nothing that looked like an altar, unless you wanted to call the table the altar, which they eventually began to call the table the altar. So anyway, we can say more about that, but what I wanted to do, I find this very poignant, really, in Revelation 19, verses 6 through 8. Let's go down to verse 6. Then I heard what sounded like a great multitude. There's John's vision. Like the roar of rushing waters and like loud peals of thunder, shouting, Hallelujah, for our Lord God Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory. For the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. You see what's being pictured is a wedding feast. It's a meal. It's Cana. It's the return of the prodigal son. And so the term has come into biblical studies and theology, the Messianic banquet. The Messianic banquet. John can actually describe the next world, the perfect world, as a meal, a banquet. So when we talk about food and eating in the Bible, we're not just talking about, greens and bread and olive oil. This had an immense symbolic meaning, and I think it's very interesting that almost universally, maybe not entirely, but almost universally, whatever form Christianity has taken from the first century down till now, the central thing that people have always tended to do is have a meal. It may be highly symbolic, but it's always been central to the idea of what the faith actually was. Okay, now, didn't do that justice, but maybe it'll give you some things to think about. And the one next week's going to be even worse because the Bible is absolutely full of slaves and slavery. And we've got to talk about that.